say, happy Women's History Month. Woohoo! I wish I had an air horn and noise makers and all sorts of stuff with me this evening. Welcome. Women's History Month is a wonderful time to celebrate the historical, political, and cultural contributions made by cisgender, transgender women, and non-binary people. And what we're going to be doing today is celebrating some of these people through this particular program. So I'm so excited that you all are here today to help us celebrate Women's History Month, a month that means so much to me and the people who are here tonight for this iteration of In Dialogue. So before I start, I would love my colleagues to introduce themselves. Becca, would you mind starting?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. My name is Becca Lundgren. I'm an education specialist at the National Air and Space Museum.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Ann Turgeson. I'm the Director of Education for the National Women's History Museum, and I have trouble with my mute button, so I apologize in advance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Irina Rubenstein, and I work at the National Portrait Gallery.
Excellent. Welcome to another edition of the National Portrait Gallery series In Dialogue, Objects and Social Justice, where we address how historical objects from different museum collections speak to today's social justice issues. Tonight, we're going to be looking at three extraordinary portraits, or actually four extraordinary portraits of women or gender nonconforming people. And we're going to discuss how a pilot, an orator, and a community worker can help all of us understand the qualities of a great leader. And just as an aside, you might be able to see, but this program will provide auto-generated captions for everyone too as well. Before I move to the next step, I'd really like to thank my co-facilitators from the National Air and Space Museum and the National Women's History Museum for joining me this evening. Women's history and progress does not exist and cannot transcend without the power of solidarity. So I thank you both. Now, before we get to the portraits, I also want to acknowledge or gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose land we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home today. We also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's strengths as well as its flaws. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. I also want to take a really brief moment to acknowledge xenophobic and anti-Asian violence going on right now in this country. In the words of the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, this is a moment for our nation to address racism and social inequities in earnest. And we at the Portrait Gallery believe that portraits can help steer these conversations. So I will be the MC for tonight. My name is Ashley Corin. I am the Women's History Content and Interpretation Curator. And once again, I'm so happy that you all have decided to join us this evening. So all of our programs, we try to ascribe to In Dialogue community norms to be able to enhance the spirit of discussion. Now, the first two community norms are respect others and their opinions, consider your own privacy and that of others.
The second two to think about, or the third one after the second two, is the thinking about before you hit the send button, especially pertinent for the chat tonight when you're sending things to panelists or all attendees, as well as if you have questions in the Q&A.
Also, we ask you to avoid inappropriate material and statements, and cyberbullying, as always, will not be tolerated.
So this is the essential question for this evening, which is, what does a leader do? Now, to help us sort of create a framework for this conversation, I wanted to actually include a definition of leader from the dictionary, right? And a leader is someone that leads, a person who leads, and apparently, I didn't know this, but a horse placed in advance of the other horses of a team. I had no idea that this was also what a leader is, but I'm sure some of you out there do, but I had no idea. So as we're going through these different portraits, I really encourage you all to think about, this definition of what a leader is, and what we expect them to do. And as we also talk about leadership this evening, I also want to pose this to all of you, right? We're talking about these three extraordinary people from really different time periods, right? And I want you to always consider the historical context that they're in, to explore where they are geographically. But in this case too, right, especially if we're talking about Women's History Month, I want you to always think about the ever looming threat of violence that all of these people had to live with. So while we're talking about their stories, while we're talking about the things that they've done, the way that they've impacted American history, right? We always want to be cognizant of, like I said, the threat of violence that always surrounded them, right? And what they were able to achieve in spite of that violence. So I'd like to start this conversation by highlighting trailblazing, gender nonconforming Latinx activist Sylvia Rivera. Now, the portrait we're looking at was actually made by artist Louis Carl from 2000. Sylvia Rivera's story is a fitting example of, in the words of our curator of painting and sculpture and Latinx art and history, Taina Carrigal, the limitations of cultural and social movements, especially in regards to gender and race, but also how much power and strength that we all hold individually. When we tap into our power, when we recognize that we have the ability to speak up and out, it can transform the world around us. Now, Sylvia Rivera spent a very long time fighting for the rights of the people in her community, especially homeless youth, and non-binary and transgender people of color in New York City. Sylvia Rivera was born in 1951 to parents of Puerto Rican descent in New York City. At the age of 18, Rivera became a founding member of the Gay Activists Alliance. And this was really, she was super young when she did this, but the Gay Rights Alliance, the Gay Activists Alliance, excuse me, was an important organization in the LGBTQ liberation movement, formerly called the Gay Liberation Movement of the 1960s and 70s. The group staged protests and carried out other forms of resistance against the unfairness and violation of civil rights that many gay people were experiencing at that time. However, after a while of being in the group, Sylvia, really had to come to terms with the group's exclusion and erasure of people of color and gender non-conforming individuals. So with that knowledge, Sylvia Rivera decided to leave, and soon after formed a new group with fellow transgender activist Marsha P. Johnson. Together, they began the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, also called STAR, an organization for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people to come together and discuss the issues that mattered to them. Sylvia and Marsha created a space for their community, the people who felt left out from the gay liberation movement, for these people to feel safe and welcome. When speaking about STAR, Rivera said, Marsha and I decided it was time to help each other and to help our kids. She said, we fed people and clothed people. We kept the building going. Now, I want to point out that Rivera was 20 years old when she founded STAR, right? So Rivera is 18, joining the Gay Activist Alliance, and then only 2 years later, founding this incredibly influential and important group, which to me is incredible, right? And then spent the next 30 years fighting and continuing to fight for civil rights for gay and transgender people. Rivera was loud and even interrupted people at rallies to speak her truth. Rivera was unafraid to challenge people, even those in the LGBTQ community who looked down on her. To me, Rivera exemplifies leadership in the following ways. One, a leader can easily identify and articulate the limitations and shortcomings of others. They make these limitations known and create solutions or processes to respond to the issue. Now, a leader sometimes has to pick up the slack for others who possess a limited vision, even though they shouldn't have to. Rivera was dealing with people in her own community who were racist, sexist, and transphobic. You know, when someone is working with a group of people or a person with limited vision, you know, a true leader sees past that and works with others to create a new one, which is what Rivera did. Now, this particular point is something that, you know, cisgendered and trans women and non-binary people of color have been dealing with for a very, very, very long time. And next, I believe that a leader brings people together around a shared goal or issue. And then finally, and this is something that I really, you know, am constantly impressed with when I learn about Rivera's story, is a leader creates or secures resources to support and protect their community. Now, I'd like everyone to sort of take a moment and look at this portrait in silence for a few moments. When you're ready, please feel free to share what you're drawn to in this picture in the chat box. What are you drawn to when you look at this image? What is the first thing that captures your eye? Now, in this portrait we're looking at, right, we have Rivera, who sits in the middle and who is surrounded by her partner, Julia Murray, on the right, and her friend, Christina Hayworth, on the left. The three figures are sitting next to a monument at a park in New York City. There is a poster placed on the bottom of the monument that says, "Respect trans people / men." Now, this picture was actually taken at a Saturday rally before the New York Gay Pride Parade in 2000. So while you all are thinking about sort of what you're drawn to and sharing in the chat box, I'd love my co-hosts to share sort of what they're drawn to in this image. Lorianne, would you mind starting?
Yeah, I think like so many others, I'm immediately drawn to the post poignant message. I am immediately fixed to the central figures and how they are unified by their clasped hands. And then the next thing that catches my eye is the monument that they're beside, which just, you know, providing that context for where they are, but also there's something about the monument in this particular portrait that it has a very solid presence, and I think it actually adds a quality to the portrait.
Yeah. Becca?
Absolutely, I agree. I was drawn to all of those things that Lorianne and so many other in the chat are recognizing as well. And I think the thing that caught me first, as well as their clasped hands, is their gaze directly into the camera. I think listening to the story that you were able to tell beforehand and then thinking about that as we're gazing back, it felt very powerful. So that was what drew me in first.
And Irina, would you mind sharing some of the responses in the chat box?
Yeah, a lot of people in the chat are noticing similar things that Lorianne and Becca pointed out. The posters specifically, what it says, respect trans people. A lot of people are noticing the grasping of hands and the camaraderie that's shown between the three sitters. And also people have pointed out the gaze of the sitters, where they're looking, and their facial expressions.
Thank you all for your incredibly insightful comments. And I just want to piggyback on Lori and Becca, because the thing that I love most about this portrait are the clasped hands, right? Like that's what really grabs me, right? This display of care and affection that signifies the three of them are a part of a community, right? Really signifying the three of them are there together in solidarity. And it signifies that, this particular, it kind of makes me feel like, okay, so like, what is my community, right? Who are the people in my own space that I feel connected to in that way, right? And then also thinking about the fact that, Rivera had to create this community herself, right? She had to go out of her way to be able to find people to be a part of her community, I think, is just, it's, on the one hand, it's frustrating and it's unfortunate, but at the time there's something really powerful about what Rivera was able to do, regardless of the treatment that Rivera was facing from her own community. So, and with that, we just talked about a community worker, and now we're going to talk about a pilot.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I love the framing of this event and thinking about all three of these people in context with each other, because oftentimes the person I'm about to talk about is a pilot, but I would argue also a community worker and activist in concert with the work that she was doing at the time. So I would like to start off actually by taking a close look at this image that you see here. This is the frontispiece from a book that's in our collection at the National Air and Space Museum, and that was on display. And you can see the title there, Black Wings by William J. Powell. And I wanted to just ask very quickly in the chat, kind of taking in for a few moments, the image that you see, the names that you see, the name of the author for the book, the title of the book that's there. I'm really curious, just in your initial reactions, and you can put it in the chat, what does everything that you see here make you wonder? Is there anything that the image makes you wonder? Anything that the words on the image make you wonder? Anything about the book's title or the author itself make you wonder? Or why it's at the National Air and Space Museum at all? I'd love to know, what do you wonder about what's on the screen in front of you? And I'm going to ask my colleagues here the same question while you're putting your answers in the chat. So I'll start with Ashley. Actually, just taking it all in and not seeing this before, though I know you have. What are some things that you wonder, taking all of this in?
Yeah. Well, one, actually, it's 1934, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 1934, if my memory serves me, we're still in the Great Depression, right, at that time. And so sort of trying to place this image in the context of history and sort of what's going on in the world at the time, I sort of wonder how this particular figure is able to engage in this kind of work, right, during this really tumultuous time in history.
That's a wonderful wonder. Thank you. Lorianne, what are you wondering right now?
I was laughing because someone in the chat said exactly what I was thinking right off the bat. What's her superpower? Because I love her long black overcoat and the way it's reflected behind her in her shadow. That's really cool, and it does give her a very heroic and strong stand. So what's her superpower? And then right behind it, again, someone in the chat said, I wonder what her story is. And so I think that kind of piggybacks off what Ashley's wondering. What's her story? How is she accomplishing what she's accomplishing during this period of time, which, as mentioned, is was a very tumultuous time.
Great. Irina, what are folks wondering?
Yeah, I love the questions that Lorianne pulled out. What's her superpower? There are a lot of people asking what her story is. There was one person that asked, is she arriving or departing? Is this a candid photo or a posed photo? And some other people are asking, how did she become a pilot? Noticing that she's a Black woman and the time period that she lived in.
These are such great wonderings. I love to start with wondering about things, especially because I can see in the chat so many instances of folks who might have heard the story before in some cases, and they're using that prior knowledge in their wondering, which is so cool. And some folks who are really honing in on the visual nature of this image, which was a really important part of it. So both of those things are things we'll explore today. I am so glad that these questions are being asked, and I'd like to actually tell a little bit, share a little bit of this story based on a lot of your questions, and starting with the who was this person, and you can see their name at the bottom of this image, and that's Bessie Coleman, who was the first licensed woman pilot of both African American and Native descent in the United States, and she received her pilot's license in 1921. That was really important for a lot of reasons I'll get into, but you can definitely tell in this image that she knows that this is important and that what she's doing is awesome. And I love that somebody mentioned that what's her superpower, because she absolutely was curating her image to specifically show her skill and prowess in this industry. And it wasn't something that she had been doing her entire life. She actually wasn't a pilot until a little bit later. At 19, she was a manicurist in Chicago, and her brother was kind of pushing her and prodding her and saying, oh, I saw all these women pilots in France. And she was like, you know what, that's it. I'm gonna become a pilot. And I started to search around for aviation schools in the United States. And because of racist laws and systems and ideas and sexist laws, systems and ideas, she was rejected from every school for both being a Black and being a woman. So she tried to find another avenue and went to her friend at the Chicago Defender, a local Black newspaper, Robert S. Abbott, and he suggested that she go to France. France had all these schools that were open to so many folks. And so he helped her learn French and find a way to get there. And she went to school in France and got her pilot's license. She then came back to the United States and traveled all over the country doing exhibitions and barnstorming events. And these were really important in a lot of ways. It showed her skill at flying. It got people excited. She was performing in front of desegregated crowds, which was very important to her, that these crowds were, and refused to perform if that wasn't held to as much as possible by the organizers in the venues. And during that time too, she was advocating for Black men and women all over the country to become pilots themselves and learn how to fly. I actually wanted to share some of her own words that were shared in an issue of the Chicago Defender in 1921, just after she got her pilot's license. And when she was asked why she was drawn to being a pilot, she said, well, because I knew we had no aviators, neither men nor women, and I knew the race needed to be represented along this racist important line. So I thought it my duty to risk my life to learn aviating and to encourage flying among men and women of the race who are so far behind of the white man in the special line. I made up my mind to try, I tried, and I was successful. She has many interviews like this in newspapers, both Black newspapers and white newspapers across the country during the time that she was flying, all the way up until she passed away tragically in an accident in 1926. Now, the fact that she was really interested in inspiring, being a leader in her community for folks to get into aviation as a way of not just being excited about aviation, because it was an exciting feat, but also entering industry and being part of the economics of the time in this new industry, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. And that inspired so many folks. Thousands of people came to her funeral, including Ida B. Wells. and people visited her at multiple sites across the United States after she passed. The reason I bring up this object in particular is it's actually not an object that was made during the time she was alive. She passed away in 1926, and this object is a book that was published in 1934 by William J. Powell, who, a Black man and an aviator and entrepreneur, was inspired by her work and started the Bessie Coleman Aero Club, as well as Bessie Coleman Aero, a aviation company. So I love to bring up this book as well as her portrait to think about how being a leader in a field, what that means, and how your legacy can continue on for so long, even after you've passed. Yeah, and you can read more about it. Thank you, Irina. You can read more about the objects and her story in the links in the chat.
And then I would like to talk about another venerable woman, Sojourner Truth. And before we kind of take a deeper look at these portraits you see before you, I want to tell you a little bit about her life, because there is a lot of mythology around Sojourner Truth's life. She was born under the name Isabella Baumfree in the late 1700s to a large enslaved family in upstate New York. She was sold 3 times by a series of owners prior to age 11. Her native language was Dutch. She learned English the hard way, fully immersed in the language by slaveholders who often beat her when she didn't understand what they were saying. She eventually married and had children and escaped slavery in the 1820s by running away from her owners. Her 5-year-old son was not so lucky. He was sold out of state illegally, but Truth successfully fought the court system to have him returned to New York, which was an unfathomable accomplishment at this time. She was a spiritual woman who put her spirituality at the forefront of her activism, championing both abolition and women's rights. Her straightforward, common sense approach to equality was founded in her powerful divine beliefs, and she amassed a large following of supporters. She was the guest of 3 sitting presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. And although she was not invited to attend, let alone speak at the Women's Suffrage Convention of 1851, speak she did, thereby furthering her cause and renown as an activist. In 1863, 2 articles made Truth famous to a wider public, and this is where that mythology starts coming in. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the popular Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote an article about Truth for the Atlantic Monthly, describing her as the Libyan Sybil. Stowe described Truth as a vibrant woman whose quote unquote conversation was simple, strong, and shrewd. But her article, based on one meeting with Truth a decade earlier, incorrectly stated that Truth was from Africa and that she had recently died, neither of which is true. Later that same year, the women's rights activist Frances Dana Gage praised Truth's speaking talents at the 1851 convention in the New York Independent, writing that Truth's quote unquote magical influence had turned the whole tide in favor of women's rights. Both Stowe and Gage's portrayals of Truth were largely mythical versions of this venerable woman, and Truth wanted to popularize her true self. She took advantage of her new fame and sat for the first photograph that she would then sell to help support herself financially. And the images you see here are from the National Women's History Museum's 1881 copy of Truth's autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. So Truth was illiterate. She did not read or write, so she had to dictate her memoirs to a friend to record them for her. So now I'd like to invite you to take a moment to take a closer look at these images. What do you see in the images? How do they differ? Consider what impression they give you about Truth, and go ahead and share those in the chat if you don't mind. Her likenesses depict her as modest and intelligent. They emphasize her Blackness, and this was intentional. She eventually settled on a preferred pose and props, such as those seen in the 1864 carte de visite. So the 1864 carte de visite is the one you see on your left. In her late 60s at this time, Truth sits next to a table with her knitting needles and work in her left hand, while in the scarred fingers of her right hand, she grips the tail of her yarn, which unwinds down the length of her skirt as though she was interrupted mid-stitch. Knitting implied feminine domesticity, as well as a practical skill for any woman at this time. The bouquet of flowers and table imply a domestic setting, while her book and wire-rimmed glasses reference her intelligence and inclusion in elite educated circles. The wire-rimmed glasses, by the way, were a quote-unquote novelty, according to one of her contemporaries. So again, she's doing this intentionally to curate her look. Her signature white head wrap, simple dress, and modest shawl draw the eyes upward to where light seems to illuminate both her dark skin and serious expression. This is the real Sojourner Truth, not the myth. She was someone who survived by relying on her own strength of character, having been afforded no natural platform due to her station in life as Black, illiterate, uneducated, and a formerly enslaved woman. Irina, did we get any interesting answers in the chat?
Yeah, I saw an observation that both portraits have a similar pose, but one has the absence of knitting. They both have quotes of Sojourner Truth, or at least words in the portrait itself. And one person said that they can see wisdom and beauty in the portraits.
I love it. I love it. Those are wonderful observations. And I like that you're really paying attention to her pose and what's missing from the second one. So Truth had her portrait taken at least 7 times between 1863 and 1875, resulting in at least 14 different versions of her likeness. The poses vary slightly, but she consistently composed herself according to conventions for representing middle-class women. Middle-class women who never thought of selling their portraits. The pictures, the poses imply that she subscribed to mainstream notions of femininity. However, her activist speeches and her intentional controlled use of personal branding suggest no such thing. In 1873, Truth replaced the previous portrait of herself with a new engraving that was based on the 1864 image in new editions of the narrative of Sojourner Truth. So the museum's copy of this book is a 5th edition, for example, and includes both these images. In the new engraving, which is the one you see on the right, the artist has simplified the composition, as someone rightly noted, taking out the trademark props of knitting needles and flowers, and even softening Truth's facial expression and tilted the head with a gentler visage. Both versions demonstrate a Black woman embodying a feminine domestic ideal at a time when contemporaneous imagery of Black women often portrayed them as unintelligent servants, curiosities, or even worse, as scientific experiments. So why are these images of Truth so important to our understanding of her leadership? Female reformers during these times largely kept their likenesses private to maintain their respectability in a society that frowned upon public political women. But Truth did not have the same inherent respectability that a middle-class white woman had. Instead, she turned the fact that she didn't have a natural platform into an advantage. She carried out her own personal visual campaign that no respectable white middle-class female reformer would have done to illuminate a positive vision of women of color. Truth chose to claim this power for herself. During the 1860s and 1870s, portrait photographs became essential tools to define and win political power. Printed portraits acted as extensions of individuals and their ideas. Truth, a Black female reformer, circulated her portrait to establish models for other women and to counter negative racist stereotypes. While she lacked the natural power, literacy skills, and funding to compete with mainstream publications, she could and did use the power of her own portrait, her own personal branding, to her advantage and that of the social movements for which she advocated. So my own definition of a leader is someone who inspires others and influences outcomes, regardless of whether that person is in a position of power or not. Sojourner Truth was someone who led without power by utilizing every natural talent that she possessed: her plain speech, her strength of character, her rock solid faith, her very image, to inspire others and ultimately influence the most pressing challenges of the 19th century. She had moral power, exactly, Catherine. So I invite you to think about, what are your natural talents? What do you possess that you can use to make a change, to make a difference? Bearing in mind that it can be small.
And I love how you brought us to the last third of our program, Lorianne, right? This idea of thinking about the natural talents that we all possess that we can leverage, right? The way that we can demonstrate leadership in our own ways. And I'd love to, talk to both you and Becca about sort of these, how these women really brought change to their own communities. And a part of that change was literally modeling, right, how someone could be, right? Not necessarily how someone should be, but modeling how someone could be, right? So I'd love for the both of you to sort of chime in sort of on this idea.
I love that you mentioned that, because as Lorianne was talking and thinking about Bessie Coleman's images, which she very much in the same way was curating that image, she was doing two things at the same time, where she was trying to model how flight and aviation could be something of worth and easier for folks in the Black communities across the United States. So she tried to not make it look too hard, like easy and you can do this too, while at the same time modeling for white audiences that this was a skill set, this was absolutely difficult, and that she was up to the challenge and she had the skills to do it. So she was also dealing with that dual representation within everything that she was doing in order to bring that change to her community.
Oh, sorry, Lorianne, did you have something?
I was just going to agree with Rebecca. I was struck by how the bit I know about Bessie Coleman's life, that she worked in a very similar vein, and all three of these individuals sort of have this common thread. And Ashley, I think you brought this up at the beginning about how they were really on the margins of society. You think about Truth, former slave, illiterate, Black woman. She sort of ticks all the boxes for a marginalized person during the context of her time. Similarly with Bessie Coleman, I mean, facing, trying to break into a male-dominated field, being Black, being female. And the same thing with Rivera, Sylvia. Again, marginalized because of who she was. And really taking the best of their personalities and their intellect and their natural talents, and curating an image of this is the best of us, and it's a quiet form of leadership, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. It's again leading without power.
Yeah.
And people have mentioned in the chat kind of that same idea. Just being present can be powerful, especially when erasure and silencing is used against your community. And also willingness to participate and bring experiences to the table, endeavoring to foster positive growth approach to change.
Thank you, Irina. One other conversation that I'd love to have with the two of you, and this is just something that's come up through sort of hearing your analysis of a portrait, but this idea of leadership and femininity, right? And how those things are expressed through these portraits, right? I'm thinking about, in this particular image of Sylvia Rivera, right? I mean, this is a very this is a sort of a two-sided idea of femininity, right? But they're all holding hands, right? They're demonstrating care, they're demonstrating love and affection, which is sometimes, historically seen as feminine, right? Showing affection, showing love, showing care. And then thinking about the Bessie Coleman image, right? Where completely covered, right? But wearing this really dynamic outfit, right? And something that is inherently not feminine, right? And then I think about the Truth portrait, where there are literally objects in the picture that were placed intentionally, right, to demonstrate a kind of softness with Truth, right? And how these different sort of interpretations have really different outcomes, right, for these three women, right? Sort of playing this idea of either challenging what is feminine or embracing it in order to get their message across. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought it up in the context of Bessie. As I was preparing to talk with you all, I was reading a little bit about how, and I'm remembering all the conversations about especially white women pilots at the time. The first white woman in the United States got her pilot's license a decade before Bessie. And there was a cultural image creation around white women pilots in the United States that was often very feminine. The first white woman pilot, Harriet Quimby, had a very kind of feminine image on purpose. And that was part of kind of the selling point. Whereas being a Black woman, that selling point immediately like cut down. And so she had to think of other ways to make sure that her presence was known, and that skill set that she was showing by doing, I definitely recommend looking up barnstorming after this. It's really cool to see all the tricks and shows, just showing how skilled you were as a pilot was definitely a tool she used to kind of assert that presence in a way that she was not, that society was not allowing her to assert because she was a Black woman. So I'm really glad that you asked the question about femininity and how it played a role here. Thank you.
And really for Truth, femininity and expressing it in a positive way was essential to her messaging, because she was fighting for women's rights. And this is, again, at a time when Black women were not considered feminine, and she wanted to break down that stereotype, and this is something she constantly challenged, hence the pose, hence the dress, that dress, the shawl, particularly the head wrap. They were literal trademark items that you'll see throughout her portraits, but bringing in the props that she did and making these intentional choices to demonstrate her femininity was only to help support her message for women's rights. They have to see me as feminine, as woman, as one of them, in order for me to gain their ear so that I can advocate for equality for all women, Black or white.
And, thinking about, us being in 2021, right? There's something that's very telling about these three images. There's something that's also kind of disappointing, right? When you think about images of women of color in leadership, of Black women in leadership, of Latinx women in leadership, right? The fact that, they're still fighting these tropes, right? They're still figuring out ways to be visually represented, or still battling visual representations of them that don't allow for this nuance, right? Or don't allow for the fact that, like, there's so many different types of people in this world, right? And there are different people who use different approaches to carrying out different forms of leadership, right? Or making impacts in their communities, right? And so there's something really interesting about this conversation, particularly in 2021, right? Where we have a woman of color vice president, right? And this idea of, even, thinking about Kamala Harris and all of the controversy with that Vogue shoot, right? thinking about how women in leadership are being depicted, and how this history continues, right? How these dialogues continue.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because thinking about Bessie Coleman's legacy specifically, I mean, this is an image in the cover of a book by somebody else who was inspired by, and her legacy was definitely lifted up and amplified specifically within her, within Black communities, aviation communities, particularly around the country. And that kind of her own conscious image creation and that of others, knowing that her name had power in the situation, and so they were going to leverage it to then create their own things like these aero clubs, which were inherently more inclusive than other aviation clubs at the time, allowing men, women, different genders, and folks of different races as well, on purpose, as opposed to like the 99s, which was a women's aviation club, but had a predominantly white membership. And so I really, when we think about how those images continue on and who's using them to their advantage, is another really important part of Coleman's story.
And I think it's important, yeah, it is depressing, by the way, that these battles continue, but it's because the same issues still apply. I think when you're considering women's history, it's very important to think of feminism in the plural sense, feminisms, because really Black, white, Latina women really pursued different paths of feminism. And if you think about Bessie Coleman, Sojourner Truth, Kamala Harris, the things that they're battling are multifold. It's race, it's being a woman. So it's multiple factors. If you think about Sylvia Rivera, I had a conversation with a Latina historian recently, and she said, you know, with Latinas, we're battling machoism and the expectation that as a woman, you should not be ambitious. That's considered unfeminine. And so there's these multiple barriers that have just continued throughout women's history. And they're different for each segment of society. So it's really feminisms, pathways of feminisms that have to be examined. And as you stated, it continues to impact women today just as much as it did back in, say, Sojourner Truth's time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a great point, right, to end with, right, this idea of intersectionality and how these women in their respective times, right, had to either have a really great strategy for dealing with this, right, for dealing with the various barriers that they faced, and thinking about how the women we're looking at today reacted to it, right? We have Sylvia Rivera, who was like I said, was loud, was in people's faces, right? And always spoke up. Like I said, there's this really famous clip from 1973 where Sylvia Rivera literally gets up on stage as someone is speaking, takes the mic, and just, you know, starts calling people out for being exclusive, right? And then, you know, we have Bessie Coleman, right, through the work, right? The engagement is through her work and through the demonstration of that work, right? And doing the work, right? And being the best pilot that the world has ever seen, right? During her time. And then we have Truth, who has her own strategy, right? Her own brand of leadership that she exemplifies to be able to do the wonderful things that she's able to accomplish in her lifetime. And so I think it's super important for all of us to recognize that, you know, there's something to learn from all of these stories, right? On how to move forward and how to connect with different groups of people, right? How to strategize, right? How to brand ourselves, right? But it's not a one size fits all, right? We can all learn something from all of them, but it's up to all of us to sort of create our own approaches and our own strategies to combating all of these isms. And so with that, we want to leave you all with one last question to think about, right? As you walk away from this program, right? Which is, what will be your legacy? When thinking about these three amazing people and the accomplishments and their impact, right? That we're still experiencing, right? Still experiencing to this day. Thinking about the work that they did, thinking about the approach, the work they did, the way that they created their own sort of brands of leadership. What can we take from that? And then how can we apply that to our own lives? What are the examples of leadership that you're going to leave behind, right? And it doesn't have to be big, right? Because all these people were directly speaking to their communities, right? And gratefully for all of us, their voices expanded beyond that, right? Beyond their communities. But sometimes it really just starts where you are. And so really taking that into consideration. And so with that, I'm going to leave a few minutes for some questions. If there are any questions in the chat box, Irina.
Yeah, we actually have two questions in the Q&A. The first, I think, is referring to the Sylvia Rivera portrait and wondering about the monument and if it has a relevance to the portrait.
So that's a great question. I know that it's somewhere in Central Park. I don't know if Taina is here, but I do know that it's in Central Park. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what the monument is and sort of what its relevance. So that is a fantastic question, and I have to dig a little bit deeper.
There's also another question in the Q&A, and it asks, can you talk about the history of the two movements, the LGBTQ+ and the women's group share?
May I suggest that that is a topic that we're not going to be able to cover in the next 5 minutes. Because, let me explain myself. Because both of those, although we think of it as a women's movement and we think of it as the LGBTQIA movement, they're not singular. In both of those, they are movements. And they're intersectional and complex. And so I don't think that that is a topic that we could adequately address in the time that we have left today.
But if you're looking to learn more, please look up the Gay Activists Alliance. There is scholarship on that particular group and the Gay Liberation Front too, as well, which are sort of two groups that Sylvia Rivera was a part of while living in New York City. So if you do want to sort of start somewhere, I would start there. But I would also go to, I mean, Sylvia Rivera, currently there is oh my goodness, my brain is gone. But there was a group that was created in Sylvia's name. It's the Sylvia Law Project, I believe. That exists, and they have information on Sylvia too as well, and it's wonderful. And if you're looking to learn more about Sylvia, the Smithsonian Latino Center, along with Taina Carrigal, created a video about Sylvia Rivera. So if you just Google Smithsonian Latino Center and Sylvia Rivera, the video on YouTube will show up. All right. Do we have any other questions, Irina?
I don't see any.
Okay.
But can I plug the next in dialogue?
Oh, I was actually going to do that, but if you want to do that, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ashley. Go ahead.
Okay. And as Irina said, we have an upcoming program on April 8th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is the Next in the In Dialogue series featuring the National Museum of the American Indian. The topic is, what is the connection between a desire for recognition of one's culture and activism for equity? So please come join us. There are still registrations open for that particular event. You can find it on Eventbrite. I don't know, Irina, am I missing something? All right. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And I want to give a special thank you to Becca, Lori Ann, and Irina for making this program what it was tonight. This was a blast. Does anyone have any last remarks before we say goodnight to everyone?
I just want to thank Ashley for leading and facilitating this conversation and being a leader that I'm inspired by this month. And always.
Yes, thank you, Ashley, for bringing us together. This was a great conversation. I so enjoyed it.
And with that, have a wonderful night and take care of yourselves.